In the early morning hours of September 3rd, a three-alarm fire ravaged the two buildings just to the north of the old Berkshire Hotel, addressed 113 to 117 North 5th Street. The cause of this fire is still under investigation, but there are reports that people heard a loud explosion to the rear of the structures before it began. Everyone made it out safely, thankfully. From what I have been told, it seems like these buildings may be structurally compromised due to the fire, and whether or not they are going to be able to be repaired has still yet to be confirmed. All of this prompted me to want to look into the history of the buildings. This is its story. These properties were constructed around 1911 by Francis F. Seidel. He was born in 1858 in Bern Township and educated in the public schools there. Seidel decided on an apprenticeship with an undertaker named E.S. Miller. He spent a decade learning the trade and eventually opened his own business in 1888 at 124 North 5th Street. In 1890, he purchased the house addressed 117 North 5th Street, which he used as his personal residence and place of business. At this time, embalming was still fairly new and not widely used, so bodies were buried very quickly after death to avoid decomposition. Also, funerals were widely conducted at the home of the deceased, so Seidel didn't need a large building to work out of. His job mainly consisted of getting the body ready for presentation before burial. Around the turn of the 20th century, the funeral business was changing rapidly. Other local funeral directors like Theodore Aumann and Stoneman Willie were on the pioneering front of utilizing embalming agents, which allowed bodies to be preserved for longer before burial. The other main transition of this period was the introduction of a funeral parlor, which extended the responsibilities of an undertaker to funeral hosting and event planning. Seidel is also credited in his 1934 obituary as introducing the very first automobile hearse to ever be used in the city. With this transition, Seidel clearly needed more space than his small colonial-era home could provide. So in 1910, he purchased the next-door home at 113 North 5th Street. It seems as though construction began pretty quickly, as only a year later, the Reading Times reported that his Swan apartments were completed, and that he and his family were moving in while construction on 117, the location of his new funeral operations and offices next door, would begin. The 117 structure housed funeral operations on the first two levels, and the upper two floors were used as even more apartments. This and the storefront at 113 would have been supplemental income for the Seidel family. The Seidels, including Francis and his children and their families, continued to live in the apartments as well, so it is safe to assume they were fairly luxurious accommodations at that time. In 1931, a considerable addition was constructed onto the back of the property, which included a large chapel with a 2-manual organ and a crematory. The chapel was described in an April 1932 grand opening article. It is of colonial architecture with great ivory columns, walnut pews, massive crystal chandeliers, and stained glass windows. Another feature is a crematory, the only one in the state outside of Philadelphia. It is beneath the chapel, in which there is a special lowering device in front of the chancel to lower bodies. This structure was untouched by last week's fire and is currently home to La Gala Banquet Hall, according to Google Maps. Francis F. Seidel died on January 25, 1934, when his automobile was struck by a train on his farm property along the Fritztown Road near Fritztown. The Lebanon Valley Line, which was a passenger route from Lancaster to Reading, was due at Sinking Spring Passenger Station at 5:03 p.m. The crossing at which he was struck was a private one, on his farm's property. His son Herbert was quoted in the obit. "It is quite customary for father to drive to the farm several times a week. Since he drove across those tracks so many times, I can't understand that he didn't hear a whistle or see the train." The article also mentioned that Francis was alone, and his wife Amelia was in Reading shopping at the time of his death. However, Amelia would die less than 2 weeks later at their home at 117 North 5th of lobar pneumonia. Sons Herbert and Calvin moved out of the Swan apartments after their parents' death, but continued to head the business their father created. In 1945, another location was opened on Penn Avenue in Sinking Spring by the grandson of the founder, named Francis F. Seidel II. which operated until his retirement in 1988. The original business continued to operate out of the buildings on North 5th until 1984, when obits in the Reading Eagle indicated that their location changed to 247 Penn Street, which we also know is the longtime location of Allman's funeral home. This seems to indicate to me that Allman's absorbed the Seidel business, although I can't find a specific article that substantiates that. At the very least, their business namesake was operating out of Allman's facilities until the early 2000s, after which it ceased to be published in the Reading Eagle at all. The buildings at 113 to 117 North 5th continue to be utilized as apartments and business space since. Most recently, a unique Victorian-themed cafe named Ma Patisserie opened a little over a year ago in the storefront at 113. Unfortunately, they sustained major water damage and are currently figuring out next steps. Dozens of residents have been displaced, and the donation drive was held this past Monday. But if anyone still has anything to donate, they can do so at any City of Reading Fire Department.